Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive with us. Today, we'll be exploring the world of microeconomics. Now, as students of economics, I know you're probably already familiar with at least some of the core concepts,
hmm
but we're aiming to go a little bit deeper than those textbook definitions today. Really try to understand how these principles actually work in the real world.
And our guide for this journey, this deep dive, is going to be Microeconomics Demystified by Dr. Craig A. Dupkin II.
Great book.
Yeah.
Really engaging.
It's a text known for its clear and engaging approach to a subject that can sometimes seem a little bit daunting. So,
Definitely, yeah.
Dr. Dupkin has a real knack for making economics relatable.
He does, yeah.
He understands that it's not just about, those abstract models and equations.
Yeah,
At the heart of it, economics is about human behavior.
exactly.
How people, individuals, businesses, and societies make decisions when we can't have everything we want, when there's scarcity.
Right. And scarcity is exactly where I'd like to start our deep dive. It's such a fundamental concept in economics,
Yeah.
right? Dr. Depkin uses this really thought-provoking example. A father who wants to spend more time with his kids,
Right.
but he's also got to work, got to provide for the family.
Yeah.
And it highlights that, even time, something that we often take for granted, that's a scarce resource.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating about that example is it highlights how scarcity forces us to make choices.
Yeah.
The father can't have, all the time in the world with his children needing, tons of money, tons of income.
Right.
He has to make trade-offs.
There it is.
And this concept of trade-offs, it's really at the core of economics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Depkin, he introduces this idea of local non-satiation,
Right.
which maybe sounds a little bit technical, right, at
Yeah.
first. Can you break that down for us a little bit and explain, why is this important?
Sure. It essentially means that people within certain limits, right?
Yeah.
Generally prefer to have more of the things they enjoy.
Okay.
It's not necessarily about greed or materialism.
Okay.
It's just this basic human desire for more of what we perceive as good. So more time with loved ones, more leisure activities, even more material possessions.
So you're saying, even if I'm incredibly wealthy, I'm still facing scarcity
Mm-hmm.
because there's just always more
Exactly.
of everything.
Yeah. Our desires are essentially unlimited.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this brings us to another question, I think.
Yeah.
How do societies even organize themselves to address this problem of scarcity?
Right.
That's where the different types of economies come into play.
Yeah, the book talks about market economies,
Right?
centrally planned economies,
Right.
and then the mixed economies. Can you give us kind of a quick overview of each of those
Yeah.
and explain how they each try to tackle this, problem of how do we allocate scarce resources?
Sure. So in a pure market economy, sometimes also called laissez-faire capitalism, the government plays a very limited role. Decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, who gets it are largely left to the, households and firms interacting with each other. The idea is that this invisible hand of the market will sort of, magically guide these resources to where they can be used most efficiently.
Kind of like a self-regulating system.
In theory, yes. But in practice,
Yeah.
most economies are what we call mixed economies, meaning they combine elements of both,
Yeah.
market-based and some government allocation.
Right. And that makes sense, The government often steps in, provides some public goods like, infrastructure or national defense, things that the private sector just, might not,
Right.
or at least might not provide enough of.
Not enough of.
And they'll also, the government might step in and set some regulations, try to protect consumers or the environment.
Exactly. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the centrally planned economies. This is where the government exerts much more control
Okay.
over how these resources are allocated.
Got it.
A classic example is, the former Soviet Union,
Right.
where the government was actually setting production quotas and prices for, almost all goods and services.
Wow.
Now, this approach, unfortunately, often leads to inefficiencies.
Yeah, I can see why that would be hard to do.
It's tough for a central planner to really know what everybody wants.
Yeah, exactly. The needs and wants of every single person.
Right.
In such a large country or population.
Exactly.
So it sounds like there's always this trade-off, right? Between letting the market do its thing,
Right.
try to be efficient, but then also, the potential for government to step in and try to fix things.
Right.
Like maybe markets aren't working perfectly or they want to promote, certain social goals.
Absolutely. And finding that right balance between the markets on the one hand.
Government on the other. It's a big challenge for policymakers.
It is.
Now, to really understand how these markets actually work,
Mhm.
we need to look at some key concepts,
Yeah.
like production possibilities and trade.
Yeah.
Dr. Depkin, he uses this brilliant thought experiment.
I love this.
It's called the Robinson Crusoe economy.
Robinson Crusoe, yeah. Love that example.
Yeah.
So simple, but so powerful.
Right.
For folks who maybe haven't read the book, could you kind of set the stage for us?
Sure. Just imagine, right?
Yeah.
Robinson Crusoe, all alone, stranded on this deserted island.
Okay.
He's got limited resources, his time and energy, and he has to decide how to allocate those resources to meet his basic needs.
It's tough.
He can spend his time fishing, he can gather coconuts, he can build shelter.
So even in this, really simplified scenario, he's still facing that fundamental economic problem of scarcity.
Exactly. And this is where his production possibilities frontier comes in, his PPF.
Okay.
It's a way to represent visually the different combinations of goods and services he can produce. So for the sake of, keeping it simple, let's just say the only two things Robinson Crusoe cares about are, pizzas and sodas.
Okay.
His PPF, it would show us all the different combinations, how many pizzas, how many sodas he could produce in a given period.
Right.
What would determine what that looks like, the shape of his PPF?
That shade is crucial, right? Because it reflects the opportunity cost of producing one good versus another. So if it's a straight line, it means the opportunity cost is constant.
Okay.
But if it's bowed out, which is usually the case,
Yeah.
it means that opportunity cost increases as you produce more of one good.
Can you give us an example of why that might happen? Why might the opportunity cost increase like that?
Sure. Let's say, Robinson Crusoe, he's really good at making pizzas,
He's a pizza man.
but not so great at producing sodas. Initially, as he shifts some of his resources from, pizza production to soda production, the opportunity cost might be, relatively low. But as he devotes more and more of his resources to making those sodas, he's pulling resources away from what he's best at.
Yeah, the pizzas.
Making those pizzas, yeah. So that means he has to give up increasing amounts of pizzas to produce each additional soda.
Makes sense. The more specialized, he becomes or his resources become in producing one of those goods, the higher that opportunity cost of, switching over.
Right.
So how does this relate to the real world?
Well, the great thing about this example is that it helps us understand the principles of, these production possibilities and opportunity costs. These apply to, individuals, businesses, and entire economies.
So no matter who we are,
Right.
we're all facing these limited resources. We've got to make choices about how to allocate them.
Precisely.
So the PPF, it's like a visual representation of those trade-offs.
Jack.
It shows us what's possible to achieve,
Right.
but also reminds us that, we can't have everything all at once,
You can't have it all.
which is, I guess, that's scarcity.
Well, that's scarcity,
It's
exactly.
a tough lesson.
Okay.
And that actually brings us to trade.
Okay.
What if Robinson Crusoe isn't alone on the island?
Ooh. Now things are getting interesting.
Right.
Okay, so let's say another person, Sandy, she washes ashore.
Okay.
She's also, she can make pizzas, she can make sodas,
Right.
but she's got different skills.
Okay.
So let's say she's like, the pizza master, but maybe she's not so good at making those sodas.
Right. So that's where this idea of comparative advantage comes in, right? So
Right.
even though Robinson Crusoe, he can produce both those pizzas and sodas on his own,
Yeah.
it can still make sense for him to specialize in just one of those
Okay.
and then trade with Sandy.
So even if Robinson Crusoe is better, just in general, at making both the pizzas and the sodas than Sandy is.
They can still both benefit
Right.
from specializing and trading with each other.
That's right.
That seems counterintuitive.
It is.
Lovely.
It's a common misconception.
Okay.
The key is to look at the opportunity cost, right?
Okay.
So let's say, Robinson Crusoe, he can produce 10 pizzas or 5 sodas in a day,
Okay.
while Sandy can produce, say, 15 pizzas.
Wow, she's good at pizzas.
Yeah, she is. Or 3 sodas. So Robinson Crusoe, he's got a lower opportunity cost for producing those sodas.
Okay.
He only has to give up 2 pizzas, for each soda.
Okay.
While Sandy, she has a lower opportunity cost for producing those pizzas because she only has to give up, 15 of a soda for each pizza.
So he's better at sodas, she's better at pizzas, relatively.
Relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking, yeah.
That's where the comparative advantage comes in.
Okay.
So if they each specialize in what they're relatively better at,
Right.
and then they trade,
They both end up with more.
they can both end up with more than they could have produced on their own.
That's amazing. It really
It's
is.
like economic magic.
It is, yeah.
Right.
It's like this is a super simple example, right?
Right.
Of, two people, they're stranded on a desert island, but it shows us this really important principle of economics.
It does.
This scales up, to like the global level.
Okay.
We're not all just,
We're not all stranded.
stranded, right?
But just like Robinson Crusoe and Sandy, countries can benefit from specializing in what they're relatively better at producing
Okay,
and then trading with other nations.
right.
This is the basis for, international trade.
Okay.
It's really a key driver for global economic growth.
Right, it's like this, global network of Robinson Crusoes and Sandys,
Exactly.
each contributing, their unique
Skills and resources.
skills and resources
Yeah,
to, make a more prosperous world.
exactly.
Now, I know as, students of economics,
Yeah, right.
you're all familiar with the basic concepts of supply and demand.
Right. Supply and demand are fundamental to how market economies function.
Absolutely.
And understanding these forces is really key to analyzing how prices are determined and how these markets actually allocate resources.
Right, and that's exactly what we want to do is go a little deeper.
Yeah.
So what are some of those factors that can actually shift those supply and demand curves beyond just the basics?
Okay.
So let's say we're looking at the market for tennis balls.
Okay.
What factors, other than just, the price of tennis balls, could cause that demand curve to shift?
Well, one important factor is the price of related goods.
Okay.
So, for example, if the price of tennis rackets went down, right?
Yeah.
Making it more affordable for people to play tennis, you would expect the demand for tennis balls to go up.
Right, yeah.
Conversely, if the price of, say, a substitute good, so something like, racquetball balls went down,
Okay.
we might see the demand for tennis balls decrease.
Makes sense. So the prices of, complementary goods and those substitute goods, that can actually have a pretty significant impact on demand.
They do.
Okay. What about, changes in consumer preferences or tastes?
Sure.
Let's say, I don't know, there's a sudden surge in the popularity of, pickleball.
Okay.
Could that affect the demand for tennis balls?
Absolutely. If people start playing more pickleball and less tennis,
Right.
we would definitely expect to see a decrease in the demand for tennis balls, even if the price of those tennis balls stayed exactly the same.
Okay.
So tastes and preferences are constantly evolving,
Yeah,
and those shifts can really, impact that market demand.
absolutely. Now let's switch gears.
Or
Let's look at the supply side. What are some of the factors that could cause, the supply curve for tennis balls to shift?
one key factor is the cost of production.
Okay.
So if the price of, say, rubber, which is a key input in making tennis balls, increases,
Right.
we would expect the supply of tennis balls to decrease.
Okay.
Similarly, if wages went up for workers in the factories making those tennis balls, that supply curve would probably shift to the left because now it costs more to make them.
Got it.
Yeah.
So changes in, the prices of those inputs can directly impact supply.
Absolutely.
Okay. What about technological advancements?
Oh, yeah.
Could those affect the supply of tennis balls?
Technological innovations can have a huge impact. Imagine a new manufacturing process that allows factories to produce tennis balls much more efficiently, right? So now they use less rubber, fewer workers.
Okay.
That's likely going to increase the supply of those tennis balls and shift that supply curve to the right.
So just like with demand, there are all these factors
Right.
that can shift that supply curve beyond just, a change in the price of the tennis balls themselves.
Exactly. And understanding those factors is really key
Yeah.
for analyzing, how markets respond to these shocks and for making predictions about what markets are going to do in the future.
Right. Now this brings us to a topic that I know can be a little bit tricky for some students, elasticity.
Yeah.
It's this way of measuring how much, supply or demand actually change in response to changes in the price.
Right, or other factors.
Or other factors, yeah.
Elasticity is a pretty fundamental concept in economics and has a lot of implications for, businesses, for policymakers, even for consumers.
Let's start with price elasticity of demand.
Yeah.
Can you give us, a definition? Maybe a real-world example
Yeah.
to help illustrate, how this works.
So the price elasticity of demand measures how much the quantity demanded of a good changes in response to a change in the price of that good.
Okay.
If a small change in the price leads to a big change in the quantity demanded, we say that demand is elastic.
Okay.
But if a large change in price only leads to a small change in quantity demanded, we say that demand is inelastic.
Got it. So, for example, if the price of, I don't know, a luxury car increased a lot,
Right.
we might expect to see, fewer people buying those cars.
Right.
Like, because people could just choose, buy a less expensive car, or they could delay their purchase.
Yeah.
That would suggest that the demand for luxury cars is pretty elastic.
That's right.
But then, what about if the price of, I don't know, gasoline went up? People might not reduce their driving as much,
Right.
especially in the short run,
Right.
because they still have to, get to work and school and, run their errands.
Right. They need to get places.
So that would suggest that the demand for gasoline is more inelastic.
That's right.
Okay.
Those are great examples. And, understanding this idea of price elasticity of demand, it can actually help businesses to make better decisions
Yeah.
about their pricing.
Okay.
If they know that the demand for their product is really elastic, they're going to be pretty hesitant, to raise prices too much.
Yeah. They could lose a lot of customers.
They could lose a lot of customers, but if that demand is inelastic, they probably have more pricing power.
Interesting. Okay. So we've been talking about price elasticity of demand.
Right.
But there's another type of elasticity that's also important to understand. Income elasticity demand.
Right.
Can you explain what that is and why it matters?
Sure. The income elasticity of demand measures how much the quantity demanded of a good changes
Okay.
in response to a change in people's incomes.
Yeah.
So for normal goods, as incomes go up, we expect demand to increase as well.
Okay.
So think about things like restaurant meals, vacations, new cars.
Right.
But for inferior goods, as incomes rise, we actually expect the demand to go down.
Okay. So what's an inferior good?
Think about, those generic brand grocery items.
Okay.
Or used clothing. As people's incomes rise, they might switch to, higher quality brands. They might buy new clothes.
Right.
They reduce their demand for those inferior goods.
That makes sense. So income elasticity of demand, it helps us understand how changes in income levels can affect, all the different sectors of the economy.
Exactly. It's a very valuable tool for businesses, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Trying to anticipate how changes in those economic conditions might affect demand for their products.
Right.
It's also useful for policymakers
Yeah.
who are trying to figure out what's the potential impact of these economic policies on consumer spending.
Makes sense. Now, before we wrap up this, first part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to introduce another interesting concept that's closely related to this idea of supply and demand.
Right.
Consumer and producer surplus.
Right.
Surplus sounds like a good thing.
It is a good thing.
So what exactly are, consumer and producer surplus?
Okay.
And why should we care about those?
They represent this kind of hidden value that's generated in the market above and beyond, just the price we pay for a good or service.
Okay.
Consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for something
Yeah.
and what they actually pay.
So, okay, if I'm willing to pay like $10 for a cup of coffee,
Right.
but I, managed to find it for $5,
Right.
my consumer surplus is $5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've essentially gained $5 worth of value
Just because.
just because.
The price was lower.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on the producer side,
Yeah.
producer surplus is the difference between, the price they receive for a good and the minimum price they would have been willing to accept.
So like a measure of their profit.
In a sense, yeah.
Okay.
It represents the gain that they receive from participating in that market.
But why is it important for us to understand, this idea of consumer surplus, producer surplus?
It gives us valuable insight into how efficient markets are and what the impact of certain policies, or interventions might be.
Okay.
So, for example, if the government were to, impose a tax on a good,
Yeah.
it could reduce both consumer and producer surplus,
Okay.
which would lead to, a decrease in overall welfare.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
So understanding these concepts helps us assess, what are the real costs and benefits of these policies? Okay, so it's like saying, even if a policy, generates some tax revenue for the government,
Right.
there could still be some unintended negative consequences
There could be.
for, the consumers and producers.
Exactly.
Okay, and these concepts of surplus, they're also closely related to this idea of utility.
Right. Which is how economists measure satisfaction or happiness.
Utility. That sounds like a concept that's maybe, hard to grasp.
It's actually pretty intuitive.
Okay.
Think of it this way, right?
Yeah.
Every time you make a choice, what to buy, what to eat, how to spend your time.
Yeah.
You're implicitly trying to maximize your utility. You're trying to choose whatever is going to bring you the most satisfaction
Yeah.
or happiness,
Okay.
given whatever constraints you might have.
So if I'm, deciding between, you know, studying for my economics exam or,
Yeah.
going out with friends,
Right.
I'm essentially like weighing the potential utility that I would get from each option.
Exactly. And economists, they actually use this concept of utility
Yeah.
to model how do individuals make these choices.
Okay.
We assume that people are rational actors.
Okay.
They seek to maximize their utility.
But people don't always make rational choices,
Yeah,
right?
you're absolutely right.
Sometimes we're emotional
Right.
or, impulsive, or maybe we're just acting out of habit.
The idea of perfect rationality, it's a simplification. It's a model.
Right.
In the real world, people's decisions are affected by a lot of things, including, emotions, biases, and just plain old mistakes.
Yeah.
But
But it's still a useful concept.
it's still a useful concept.
Right.
Even though, perfect rationality is not perfect, it still provides valuable insights into, how those decisions get made and how they add up to create these market outcomes.
So utility, it's like a theoretical framework
It is.
for understanding consumer behavior.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is closely connected
It is.
to another key concept, right? Firm behavior.
Yes.
So just as individuals, are assumed to maximize their utility, firms, businesses, they're assumed to maximize their profits.
Right.
Makes sense. Businesses are, in the business of making money.
Right.
But how do they actually do that?
Right.
How do firms go about maximizing their profits?
Firms have to make a lot of decisions, what to produce, how much to produce, what price to charge, and, how to produce it.
Right.
They have to figure out, how much labor do we hire?
Yeah.
How much capital do we invest? What technologies to use?
Yeah.
And they have to do all this in a competitive market
Right.
where other firms are doing the exact same thing, vying for, those same customers, those same resources.
So it's like a really complex game of strategy
It is.
where firms are constantly trying to anticipate their rivals' moves and position themselves, in the best way possible
Exactly.
to maximize their profits.
That's right. And, understanding those strategic interactions between firms, it's really essential to understanding how markets work and how they change over time.
Absolutely. And this brings us to this idea of market structures.
Right.
Can you give us a quick overview of, what are the different types of market structures out there
Okay.
and how they affect, competition
Right.
and the outcomes that we actually see?
At one end of the spectrum, you have perfect competition,
Okay.
which means many small firms all selling, identical products.
Okay.
No single firm can really control the price.
Okay.
They're all price takers.
Okay, so it's like a level playing field where every firm is competing on equal footing.
In theory, yes, but in practice, true perfect competition.
Right.
It's pretty rare.
Yeah.
At the other end, we have monopoly.
Okay.
This is where there's only one firm in the entire market.
Got it.
So a monopolist has complete control over that market price. They can charge whatever they want.
That doesn't sound very good
No, it's not.
for the consumers.
Monopolies can lead to higher prices and lower output, which is
Yeah.
generally not great for society.
Right.
So that's why we have antitrust laws.
Right. The government steps in,
DINSAC.
tries to prevent these monopolies from forming.
Right.
Or at least regulate how they, how they behave.
Exactly.
Okay, so we got perfect competition, we got monopoly.
Right.
Are there like some in-between market structures?
There are. We have things like, monopolistic competition
Okay.
and oligopoly.
Okay, what are those?
So in monopolistic competition, there are many firms, but they sell products that are, slightly different.
Okay.
Think about, restaurants
Okay.
or clothing stores.
Right.
Each one tries to create, a unique brand or image
Yeah.
to attract customers.
Right.
And in an oligopoly, there are just a few large firms
Right.
that dominate the market. The airline industry is a good example.
Got it.
Oligopolies can be very competitive, but they also have the potential to, collude and act like a monopoly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So understanding those different market structures,
Right.
it helps us to analyze, like, what's the competitive landscape out there?
Right.
And, maybe even try to predict how firms are going to behave in different situations.
Exactly. And it helps us understand, the potential role of government in promoting competition and preventing, these abuses of market power.
Right. Now, we've talked a lot about the markets for goods and services.
Right.
But we also need to think about the markets for the factors of production.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. The inputs that firms actually use to make those goods and services.
Right. We have markets for, labor,
Right.
capital,
Yeah.
and land. Each of these markets, they also function, according to these principles of supply and demand,
Right.
just like those markets for goods and services.
Yep.
But there are also, some unique characteristics of each
Okay.
factor market.
So let's start with the labor market.
Okay.
Who are the suppliers and demanders in this market?
Right.
And what determines wages?
So in the labor market, households,
Yeah.
they're the suppliers of labor,
Yep.
and firms are the demanders.
Got it.
So workers, they offer their time, their skills
Right.
in exchange for, wages. Firms, they hire those workers to produce those goods and services.
Makes sense.
The wage rate for a particular type of labor is determined, by that intersection of the supply and demand curves.
So if the demand for, I don't know, software engineers is high, but the supply is relatively low,
Right.
we would expect, software engineers to be earning
Higher wages.
higher wages. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. And if the supply of, let's say, unskilled labor is high,
Yeah.
but the demand is, relatively low, you'd expect those unskilled workers to have lower wages.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the market for capital?
So capital refers to the tools, machines, and equipment that firms use to produce those goods and services.
Right.
In the capital market, households are the suppliers of capital
Okay.
through their savings.
Got it.
And firms are the demanders of capital for investment purposes.
So when I deposit, money into a savings account,
Right.
I'm essentially supplying capital to the market.
Yeah. And when a firm borrows money to build a new factory, they're demanding capital.
Okay.
Exactly. The interest rate,
Uh-huh.
that is the place of capital. It
Yeah.
represents, that return that savers get for lending their money. But it also represents, the costs that firms incur when they borrow money to invest.
Okay.
Right.
That makes sense. And then finally, we have the market for land.
Right.
Land is unique because it's, we can't just create more of it.
Right. It's fixed.
So that supply curve for land is perfectly inelastic.
It is. No matter how high the price goes, that quantity supplied stays the same.
So the price of land is totally driven by demand.
It is.
Okay.
And the demand for land comes from, all sorts of places.
Yeah.
Agriculture, housing, commercial development, even just conservation efforts.
So if a city is experiencing, like a population boom,
Right.
leading to more demand for housing, we would expect to see, those land prices going up or rents going up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Scarcity, drives value. And in the case of land, that scarcity it's just built in.
Right.
You also have to consider things like, the location and quality of the land.
Right.
So a plot of land in a, prime downtown location is going to cost a lot more than a similar sized plot out in, a rural area.
Makes sense.
It's all supply and demand.
It's all supply and demand.
That's right.
Now, before we move on to our final segment, I want to circle back to a point that Dr. Depkin really, he emphasizes this throughout the book, the distinction between efficiency and equity.
Right. That's a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
And it's one that, often sparks a lot of debate
Among economists.
among economists
Right.
and policymakers.
Right.
Right. Sure.
Do you remind us, what those terms actually mean
Sure.
and why they matter so much?
So efficiency, in this economic sense,
Yeah.
refers to how well resources are allocated
Okay.
to produce the goods and services that, society values the most.
Okay.
An efficient market is one that maximizes total welfare.
Okay.
So you're taking into account, the benefits to the consumers,
Right.
the cost to the producers.
So it's about like getting the most bang for your buck.
It is.
Yes.
Yes.
Getting the most out of those limited resources.
Exactly.
Okay.
Equity, on the other hand,
Yeah.
is concerned with fairness
Okay.
and the distribution of, those benefits and costs. It asks, who benefits from this economic activity?
Right.
Who's bearing the costs?
Right.
Are those costs and benefits distributed fairly?
Right. And those two goals.
Right.
Efficiency and equity.
Right.
Sometimes they're in conflict.
They can be.
Right.
Absolutely. So a policy that might, promote efficiency
Right.
could make inequality worse.
Okay.
And a policy that tries to, redistribute income might create inefficiencies
Okay.
or, discourage people from working or investing as much.
So it's kind of like a balancing act
It is.
for policymakers.
It is. And there's no easy answer. It really is a matter of values and priorities.
Right.
But it's critical, I think,
Yeah.
to understand these concepts and how they work together,
Right.
to make good decisions.
Informed decisions about,
Informed decisions.
about policy.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of decisions,
Yeah.
it's time to tackle a topic that I know a lot of students
Okay.
find pretty challenging.
What's that?
Market failures.
Market failures. Those sound ominous.
They can be.
Okay.
So a market failure occurs when the market, just left to its own devices,
Yeah.
fails to allocate resources efficiently. It's like the invisible hand fumbles the ball.
Drops the ball.
Drops the ball, yeah. We talked about this before, this invisible hand that's supposed to guide those resources to their most efficient use.
Right.
So what are some examples of situations where that might not happen?
Right, with that invisible hand.
Where it fails to do its job.
Yeah.
One classic example is public goods.
Public goods. Can you remind us what those are again?
Sure.
Just to, refresh our memory.
Public goods are goods that are non-excludable
Okay.
and non-rivalrous.
Okay.
Non-excludable means, it's very difficult or impossible to prevent people from consuming the good even if they don't pay for it.
Okay.
And non-rivalrous means that one person's consumption of the good doesn't reduce another person's ability to consume it.
So things like, national defense,
Right.
clean air.
Right.
I can't be prevented from enjoying those even if I don't pay taxes.
Right.
And, me breathing the clean air, it doesn't prevent you from doing the same thing.
Exactly. And because of, these characteristics, these public goods,
Yeah.
they're often underprovided by the market.
Yeah.
So why would a private company invest in, providing national defense if they can't charge people for it?
Right.
And why would anyone voluntarily pay for clean air if they can, get it for free?
Right. So the market fails to provide these goods.
Right.
Because there's just, no way to capture the full value,
Exactly.
their benefit.
That's right. And that's why governments often step in to provide, those public goods.
Right.
Or to regulate their provision.
Right. Right.
What about other types of market failures?
Another important one is externalities.
Okay.
An externality occurs when the production or consumption of a good imposes costs or benefits
Okay.
on third parties who are not involved in the actual transaction.
Okay.
So classic example.
Yeah.
Pollution.
Yeah.
Right. If a factory is, polluting a river,
Right.
that imposes costs on the people who live downstream,
Right.
even if they never buy anything from that factory.
Exactly.
Oh.
That's a negative externality. There are also positive externalities.
What's a positive externality?
Vaccinations
Okay.
are a great example.
Yeah.
When people get vaccinated, they're not only protecting themselves,
Right.
but they're also reducing the risk that they're going to spread that disease to other people.
Right.
So this creates this positive spillover effect
Yeah.
for the whole community.
So the market might underprovide vaccinations.
Yeah.
Because, individuals are not taking into account
Right.
those benefits
They don't account for.
they're providing to others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why governments often, subsidize those vaccinations or even mandate them in
Right.
certain cases.
Okay. So we talked about public goods.
Right.
We talked about externalities.
Mhm.
Are there other types of market failures?
Another big one is information asymmetry.
Okay.
This occurs when one party in a transaction has more information
Okay.
than the other party.
So, give me an example.
Think about the used car market.
Okay, used cars. Yeah.
The seller usually knows a lot more about that car
Right.
than the potential buyer.
Yeah.
And this can lead to a market failure because buyers, they might be reluctant to pay, a fair price for a used car if they're worried about hidden problems.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to get a used car inspected
Right, exactly.
before you buy it.
And this can also be a problem in markets like, healthcare
Right.
or insurance.
Right. Yeah.
Where the consumer might not fully understand these really complex products.
Right. Okay. So we've got market failures can come from lots of different sources. Public goods,
Right.
externalities,
Right.
information asymmetry.
Information asymmetry.
And these failures, they can lead to all kinds of inefficiencies and even harm to individuals
They can.
or the environment.
Absolutely. That's why, it's important to be aware of them,
Yeah.
to consider, ways to address them.
Right.
Governments can play a role,
Right.
but there are also market-based solutions,
I know.
like creating markets for those externalities
Yeah.
or providing information to consumers,
Right.
to help with that information asymmetry.
It seems like there's just a lot to think about.
There is. It's a really fascinating area of economics.
Yeah.
It's got, real-world implications.
Yeah.
Understanding these concepts can help us all to be more informed.
Right.
And to make better decisions about, what should the government's role be in the economy.
Right. Exactly. Now, before we move on to our final segment, I want to touch on something that Dr. Depkin brings up towards the end of the book.
Okay.
And this is the potential downsides of competition.
That's an interesting point. We always think of competition as a good thing, right?
Drives innovation.
It drives innovation, lowers prices.
Yeah.
But are there times when competition can actually be bad?
Right. And Dr. Depkin uses the example of the airline industry here in the U.S.
Yeah.
He argues that, competition has led to, lower fares for consumers.
Right.
But it's also resulted in some unintended negative consequences.
It has.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, airlines, in trying to offer those rock bottom fares, they've cut corners in areas like safety and customer service. They've packed more seats into planes, reduced legroom, eliminated those free meals.
Right, those baggage allowance.
The baggage, exactly.
Yeah. So we're getting what we pay for in a sense.
Right.
Those cheaper flights, but maybe at the expense of, our comfort,
right,
our convenience.
Yeah, potentially, safety as well.
Yeah, there's also that issue of increased, flight delays and cancellations.
Right.
Because as these airlines are trying to maximize their profits, they're squeezing in as many flights
into that schedule
as possible into that schedule. And there's less room for error.
Exactly.
Right. The whole system just becomes more vulnerable.
The whole system.
Into these disruptions. So competition, it can be a good thing.
Generally it is.
But it can also have, these unintended consequences if it's not balanced.
Right.
With other things like, safety or consumer welfare.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that economics can be pretty complex.
It is.
And there are a lot of trade-offs to think about.
Yeah.
There's no free lunch.
There's no free lunch.
Even in microeconomics.
Even in microeconomics.
That's right.
Okay. Now, before we move on to our last segment, I want to highlight one of the key themes that runs throughout this book. And that's the importance of understanding the limitations of government intervention in the economy.
Right.
So that's something that's always going to get people talking.
That always sparks a debate.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key points that Dr. Depkin makes about, the potential downsides of government getting involved?
Well, he reminds us that governments, just like markets, they're not perfect.
Okay.
They're made up of, individuals who have their own incentives, their own biases.
Right.
And government policies, even the ones, that are created with the best intentions, they can sometimes backfire.
Okay.
Or they can be hijacked.
Right.
By, special interest groups.
Right. So it's not always just a simple case of the government stepping in and fixing a market failure.
Right. Exactly.
There's always that risk that, the cure could be worse than the disease.
It could be. It could be. We need to be realistic about what government can actually do.
Right.
And always weigh, what are the benefits of intervention? What are the potential costs?
Yeah.
And we have to hold our elected officials accountable.
Right.
To make sure that they're really, acting in the best interests of the public.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into microeconomics, I want to emphasize one of, I think, the most valuable takeaways from Dr. Depkin's book. And that is, the power of economic thinking.
Right.
It helps us to understand the world around us and hopefully to make better decisions in our own lives.
I couldn't agree more. Economics is not just this dry academic subject. It's a lens. It's a way to understand the choices we make,
Right.
The forces that shape our world, the challenges we face as a society.
Exactly. And as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want you to, the listeners, to think about how can you actually apply these concepts to your own lives,
Right.
to the world around you. How can understanding microeconomics, help you to make more informed decisions as a consumer, as a worker, as a citizen?
Right. How can it help you navigate, this complex market
Right.
and achieve your goals?
Those are great questions to ponder. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to touch on a few key takeaways, things that really stood out to me from Microeconomics Demystified.
I think one of the most powerful insights from the book is this idea that economics is really at its core about incentives.
Right.
It's about understanding how people respond to the incentives that they face, whether those incentives are created by, market forces, government policies, or just social norms.
It's like that old saying, right?
Right.
If you want to make a donkey move, you either got to offer it a carrot or hit it with a stick.
Exactly. Incentives matter.
Yeah.
And economists,
Right.
we're really interested in how changes in incentives can change behavior
Right.
and lead to different outcomes.
Okay.
So, for example, if we want to encourage people to save more money, we might offer them, tax breaks in
Right.
retirement savings accounts.
Okay.
Or if we want to reduce pollution, we might impose taxes on carbon emissions.
Right. So by understanding how incentives work,
Right.
we can design policies or even create markets
Right.
that encourage,
The behavior that we want.
the behavior we want to see. Okay.
Exactly.
It makes sense.
And this actually brings us to another, I think, key takeaway.
All right.
The importance of trade-offs.
Trade-offs, yeah.
We live in a world of scarcity, which means we can't have it all. Every choice that we make involves a trade-off.
Right.
So if we decide to spend more money on one thing, we have less money to spend on something else. If we decide to spend more time working, we have less time for leisure or family.
Right.
And
And those trade-offs aren't always easy to see
they're not.
or to measure. Sometimes the costs they're hidden
They are.
or they're delayed.
They are. They're not always obvious.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to think carefully about, what are the long-term consequences of the choices that we're making?
Right.
To consider all of the costs and benefits,
Right.
not just the ones that are, right there in front of us.
It sounds like economics is all about making tough choices.
It is in a way.
Yeah.
But it's also about understanding that those choices matter
Right.
and that they have the power to shape,
Right.
our lives
Mm.
and the world around us.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to turn our attention back to you, the listeners. As students of economics,
Right.
you're starting on this really fascinating journey
You are.
of discovery.
That's right.
You're learning a new language. You're learning a new way of thinking about the world.
And it's a language that can help you, It can unlock insights,
Yeah.
open up possibilities. Economics can help you to understand, how markets work, how businesses make decisions, how governments create policies, and how individuals, they navigate all the complexities
Yeah.
of this modern economy.
It's a tool
It is.
that can empower you
Right.
to be more informed citizens, more savvy consumers, more effective decision makers
Absolutely.
in your own life.
Absolutely.
And I think, the most important lesson of all
Right.
is this: never stop learning,
Right. That's right.
right? The world of economics, it's always changing. New challenges are going to come up. New ideas are going to be debated. Our understanding of how economies work, it's always going to evolve.
That's right.
So stay curious. Keep asking questions.
Right.
And don't be afraid to challenge conventional wisdom.
Absolutely.
Embrace, the power of economic thinking
Yes.
and use it
Yes.
to make the world a better place.
That's a great note to end on.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Microeconomics Demystified. We hope you enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you'll, continue to explore the world of economics with us.
Me too.
Until next time, keep those economic engines running.
Oh.